April 1944. Long before the crowds in London saw victory banners, long before soldiers stepped onto the beaches, a different kind of front line was already fighting in silence. It ran through muddy marshalling yards, dimly lit depots, half-frozen ports, and anonymous villages where men and women worked by blackout rules, counting crates instead of casualties. The public would remember the battles, the speeches, the flags. But the war's outcome in Europe was being shaped by something far less heroic on camera. A supply line that almost nobody talked about. A system so unglamorous that even its own commanders struggled to keep it funded, defended, and understood. It was forgotten, not because it was small, but because it was invisible. An artery buried under paperwork, rail timetables, fuel ledgers, and tonnage reports. And yet, when that artery finally ran at full strength, it changed everything. This is the part many battlefield stories skip. An army is not a single spear, it is a moving city. Every division is a machine that eats fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, food, winter clothing, radio batteries, bridging equipment, replacement boots, replacement rifles, and replacement men. It is easy to imagine war as skill and courage colliding on a ridge. It is harder to imagine war as a math problem that never stops. How many tons can be unloaded per day? How many trucks survive the roads? How many rail cars can move without being bombed? How many engines fail from overuse? What happens when a port is choked with ships but has no cranes, no workers, no cleared roads, no safe storage? These questions sound boring until you realise they decide where armies can go, how long they can stay, and whether they can exploit a breakthrough before the enemy recovers. In Europe, the great turning points often arrived not when one side wanted them, but when one side could finally feed the momentum it had already earned. The forgotten supply line that changed the outcome was not a single road on a map. It was a layered chain, ocean shipping, ports, rail hubs, truck routes, pipelines, and repair networks, rebuilt under fire and then scaled until it became unstoppable. In the early phases, the Allies had strength on paper but fragility in practice. Ships could arrive faster than ports could unload. Vehicles could land faster than mechanics could service them. And fuel could be stockpiled faster than it could be pushed forward to the units that needed it most. The enemy understood this weakness. Strikes on rail yards and bridges, sabotage, mined harbours, damaged cranes, wrecked locomotives. These were not side missions. They were attempts to starve an invasion before it could sprint. And for a time, that starvation worked. There were moments when commanders were forced to pause, not because they were defeated, but because they were empty. Engines ran dry, artillery held fire. Tanks waited in lines that looked like power, but felt like paralysis. Then, the logic flipped. The Allies began treating logistics like a weapon system, planned, protected, and accelerated with the same seriousness as an armoured thrust. They built redundancy into the chain so that one broken link could not collapse the whole. When rail lines were cut, trucks surged. When roads were cratered, engineers rebuilt them in days, sometimes hours. When ports were damaged or contested, new methods appeared. Improvised unloading systems, temporary facilities, forward dumps that moved like living organisms, and above all, an obsession with throughput. A supply line does not have to be elegant. It has to be relentless. Day after day, it must deliver more than the enemy can destroy. That is when a war changes character. The battlefield is no longer a contest of who fights better in a single afternoon. It becomes a contest of who can replace losses faster, repair damage faster, and keep pressure constant even when the front stretches hundreds of kilometers from the coast. And once that supply line reached critical mass, the battlefield began to behave differently. Breakthroughs stopped being isolated miracles and turned into patterns. A gap in the enemy line no longer meant a brief opportunity. It meant an expanding wound that could not be stitched shut. When the Allies punched through, they could sustain the push. They could keep ammunition flowing so artillery stayed loud. They could keep fuel flowing so armoured units kept moving. They could keep spare parts flowing so breakdowns did not become defeat. Most importantly, they could keep aircraft fueled, armed, and repaired so air power remained an everyday punishment, rather than a special event. The enemy might still fight brilliantly in the local sense. Ambushes, counterattacks, sudden rallies. But brilliance cannot outrun emptiness. A unit that is hungry, low on fuel, and short on replacements becomes cautious, then slow, then brittle. And once brittleness spreads through an army, a single defeat starts to ripple outward, turning into many defeats at once. This is why the war was not won on the battlefield alone. It was won in the spaces between battles, where decisions looked like administration but acted like strategy. The forgotten supply line turned the Allies into something the enemy could not outthink, because it couldn't be outlasted. It turned time into an ally. Every day that passed added more vehicles, more fuel, more shells, more trained crews, more repaired bridges, more functioning rail lines. Meanwhile, every day that passed for Germany meant fewer experienced pilots, fewer locomotives, fewer serviceable trucks, fewer safe routes, less fuel, and more pressure from the air. In a war of attrition, the side that can keep its system alive wins, even if the enemy keeps fighting with courage. The battlefield still mattered. Blood and skill still decided who held a hill at sunset. But the outcome was being decided by whether the winners could feed the next sunrise with enough supplies to make yesterday's victory permanent. By the summer of 1944, victory in Europe no longer depended on whether the Allies could break through German lines. That question had largely been answered. The real danger now lay behind the front, on roads that no longer deserved the name. What stretched across France, Belgium, and into Western Germany was not a modern transportation network, but a shattered skeleton of pre-war infrastructure. Bridges collapsed into rivers, rail yards reduced to twisted iron, highways cratered into obstacle courses of rubble and dust. From the air, the destruction looked like success. From the ground, it threatened to choke the very advance that destruction had made possible. Distance, once a strategic abstraction on a map, suddenly became an enemy as real as any opposing army. Europe's road system had never been designed for mechanized warfare on an industrial scale. Most routes were narrow, winding, and fragile, built for horse carts, civilian traffic, and peacetime commerce. Heavy tanks and endless truck convoys crushed roadbeds that had already been weakened by years of neglect and bombardment. Rain turned dirt roads into glue-like mud. Summer heat cracked asphalt, already fractured by bombs. Each kilometre gained at the front multiplied the strain behind it, because every extra mile meant more fuel burned just to deliver fuel, more tyres shredded, more engines pushed past safe limits. Armies that looked unstoppable on operational maps found themselves slowed, not by enemy resistance but by geography and physics. The destruction of infrastructure was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate Allied strategy. Bridges, rail hubs, marshalling yards, and choke points had been hammered relentlessly to isolate the battlefield and paralyze German movement. It worked, but it worked too well. Once Allied forces broke free from the beaches and surged inland, they inherited the same broken terrain they had created. Railways that could have carried thousands of tons per day lay useless. Bridges that could have shortened supply routes by hours were gone. Ports, even when captured intact, were often surrounded by road networks incapable of handling the sudden weight of an army moving at full speed. The advance outran the system meant to sustain it. Distance magnified every weakness. Ammunition trucks drove hundreds of kilometers, only to wait in traffic jams, stretching for miles. Fuel convoys consumed a significant portion of their own cargo, just reaching forward depots. A single destroyed bridge could force reroutes that added entire days to delivery schedules. Commanders began to face a cruel paradox. Success created problems faster than solutions could be built. The faster the front moved, the more fragile the supply chain became. Units paused, not because they were defeated, but because their engines were dry, their guns silent, and their men exhausted from waiting rather than fighting. Engineers became as critical as infantry. Under constant pressure, they rebuilt bridges overnight, laid steel track over rubble, filled craters with whatever material could be found, and converted country lanes into one-way arteries of military traffic. Temporary solutions became permanent through repetition. Traffic control units choreographed movement with the precision of air traffic controllers, because a single stalled vehicle could freeze an entire route. The war behind the lines became a battle against entropy. Everything naturally broke down, and everything had to be forced back into motion. Every repaired road did not just enable movement, it created the possibility of momentum. Meanwhile, the enemy understood the stakes. Retreating forces targeted roads, bridges, and rail junctions with ruthless efficiency, knowing that slowing the advance by days could buy time to regroup, reposition, or simply survive longer. What could not be defended was destroyed. What could not be destroyed was mined. Infrastructure became a weapon of delay. And yet delay alone was not enough. The Allies could rebuild faster than the damage could be inflicted, because they treated distance not as a barrier, but as a problem to be solved systematically. Where the map showed obstacles, planners saw variables. Where roads ended, alternatives were invented. By the time Allied forces approached the German heartland, the problem of distance had not disappeared, but it had been mastered. The supply system adapted, stretched, and thickened until broken roads no longer meant stalled offensives. The infrastructure was still shattered, but the flow continued. That was the decisive shift. The enemy could still destroy bridges, but could no longer stop movement. Roads no longer had to be perfect, they only had to be usable long enough. In the end, Europe's broken roads revealed a deeper truth about modern war. Victory belongs not just to the army that advances fastest, but to the one that can keep moving when the ground beneath it has been smashed into ruin. Before the first tank rolled forward and long before infantry advanced across contested ground, the Allied war effort was already moving through channels few people ever saw. These channels did not appear on dramatic battlefield maps, nor were they celebrated in victory speeches. They ran quietly through ports, rail yards, warehouses, pipelines, repair depots, and endless roads crowded with trucks. These were the hidden arteries of the war, systems so ordinary in appearance that their importance was easy to miss, yet so vital that without them, no offensive could last more than a few days. Armies may fight at the front, but they live and die by what flows behind them. Modern war in Europe demanded movement on a scale never seen before. Entire mechanized armies had to be fed, fueled, armed, clothed, repaired and replaced while advancing hundreds of kilometers across hostile territory. Every shell fired, every mile driven, every radio transmission depended on something that had been manufactured elsewhere, transported across oceans, unloaded, stored, and then pushed forward again. The hidden network made this possible. It transformed industrial output into battlefield power, converting factories and shipyards into forward momentum. Without this system, even the most brilliant tactical victory would collapse into immobility within days. At its core, the supply network was not a single route, but a layered organism. Ocean shipping formed the first heartbeat, delivering mountains of material across dangerous waters. Ports acted as lungs, inhaling cargo and exhaling it inland. Railways functioned as spinal columns, moving bulk supplies efficiently over long distances. Trucks became the veins and capillaries, reaching places rail lines could not, adjusting constantly to the shifting front. Pipelines, depots, and maintenance facilities completed the system, ensuring that fuel flowed, equipment survived abuse, and damaged vehicles returned to service. Each layer compensated for the weaknesses of the others. If one failed, another expanded to fill the gap. What made this network truly decisive was not just its size, but its adaptability. It operated in a landscape under constant attack, bombed infrastructure, sabotaged rail lines, mined roads, destroyed bridges. Yet instead of collapsing, the system evolved. Routes were rerouted overnight. Temporary facilities replaced permanent ones. Storage dumps moved closer to the front as the front moved forward. Engineers repaired faster than destruction could keep pace. Planners stopped thinking in terms of perfect solutions and embraced usable ones. A muddy road was still a road if it could carry trucks today. A damaged port was still valuable if it could unload even a fraction of its capacity. This hidden network also reshaped how battles unfolded. When supplies flowed reliably, commanders could think aggressively. They could exploit breakthroughs instead of pausing to regroup. They could keep pressure constant, forcing the enemy to react rather than plan. When the flow slowed, even victorious units stalled. Guns went quiet, engines shut down, and opportunity slipped away. Over time, the contrast became stark. One side operated with a system that grew stronger as it advanced. The other fought with a system that shrank as territory was lost. The battlefield reflected this imbalance long before it was fully understood. Perhaps most importantly, the supply network turned time into a weapon. Every day that passed added more trucks, more fuel, more spare parts, more trained personnel to the Allied side. Losses could be absorbed because replacements were already moving. Equipment could be pushed hard because repair capacity followed close behind. The enemy, by contrast, faced a narrowing pipeline, less fuel, fewer transport options, fewer trained specialists. Even when resistance remained fierce, it became increasingly brittle. Courage could delay defeat, but it could not reverse a system that no longer delivered what war required. They did not carry rifles into assault lines, and their names rarely appeared in after-action reports. Yet, they worked closer to danger than most people ever realized. The supply line in Europe was not built in safer areas. It was constructed under fire, often within range of enemy artillery, aircraft, and sabotage teams. Engineers, truck drivers, rail crews, and port workers operated in a war zone that shifted daily, where a functioning bridge in the morning could be a crater by nightfall. Their task was brutally simple and endlessly difficult: Keep the flow moving, no matter what the enemy destroyed next. Engineers were the first to confront the damage left behind by battle. They followed advancing units into landscapes torn apart by explosives, forced to turn wreckage into pathways under constant pressure. Bridges had to be replaced quickly, sometimes with prefabricated spans, hauled forward piece by piece, sometimes with improvised structures, built from whatever materials survived the fighting. Mines had to be cleared before vehicles could pass, often under the threat of sniper fire or delayed explosions. Every hour spent rebuilding was an hour the front waited, so speed mattered more than perfection. A bridge only needed to last long enough for the next wave to cross. Truck drivers carried the weight of the war on narrow roads that never stopped moving. They drove day and night through blackout conditions, mud, rain, dust, and wreckage, often without escorts and always within reach of enemy aircraft. A single convoy might stretch for kilometers, turning roads into rivers of steel and fuel. Drivers learned quickly that stopping was dangerous. A stalled vehicle could block an entire route and draw air attack. Many slept in their cabs, ate when they could, and drove until exhaustion became routine. For them, the front line was wherever the road ended that day. Rail crews faced a different kind of danger, one that arrived from the sky. Rail yards and junctions were prime targets, bombed repeatedly as both sides fought for control of movement. Crews repaired tracks while fires still burned nearby, replacing rails, sleepers, and switches at remarkable speed. Locomotives ran with patched armour and damaged signalling systems, crews relying on experience rather than instruments to keep trains moving. Sabotage added another layer of risk. A single missing bolt or loosened rail could turn a train into a weapon against itself. Despite this, rail traffic resumed again and again because bulk supplies could move no other way. The ports were no safer. Even after capture, harbours remained dangerous places filled with mines, wrecks, and unexploded ordnance. Dock workers unloaded ships under threat of air raids and long-range artillery, often using improvised equipment because cranes had been destroyed. Cargo piled up faster than it could be moved, and clearing it became a race against congestion. Every crate that stayed on the dock was a delay at the front. The pressure was constant, and mistakes were paid for in lost time or lost lives. What bound these workers together was a shared understanding that failure behind the lines could undo success at the front. They were not chasing glory. They were racing against collapse. Their work turned chaos into function, day after day, through discipline and endurance rather than heroics. When roads reopened, bridges reappeared, and trains ran again, it looked effortless from a distance. In reality, it was the result of thousands of small acts performed under stress, danger, and fatigue. On modern battlefields, the most powerful weapons are often the least visible. Long before a rifle jams or a tank is destroyed, an army can be defeated by something far more mundane: the absence of fuel, food, or ammunition. These three necessities determine whether units advance or wait, fight or conserve, survive or collapse. In Europe, entire operations slowed or stopped, not because the enemy held firm, but because supply ran dry. The war revealed a brutal truth that planners learned again and again. An army does not need to be beaten in combat to be neutralized. It only needs to be deprived. Fuel was the bloodstream of mechanized war. Without it, tanks became static fortresses and trucks useless hulks, blocking the very roads they were meant to use. Every mile advanced increased fuel consumption, not just at the front, but throughout the supply chain itself. Convoys burned fuel to deliver fuel, creating a constant drain that had to be balanced carefully. When shortages appeared, commanders faced impossible choices. Keep armoured units ready for a breakthrough or divert fuel to artillery and logistics vehicles that sustained the entire force. Even a brief interruption could freeze momentum, turning rapid advances into vulnerable pauses that gave the enemy time to regroup. Food operated more quietly, but no less decisively. Soldiers could fight hungry for a day or two, but sustained shortages eroded effectiveness in subtler ways. Fatigue deepened. Illness spread. Morale sagged. Rations were not just calories, they were routine, reassurance, and structure in a chaotic environment. When deliveries lagged, units improvised, scavenged, and stretched supplies, but these were temporary solutions. An army that eats poorly, moves poorly, thinks poorly, and reacts slowly. No amount of bravery can compensate for a body that is worn down by constant hunger. Ammunition shortages were the most immediately dangerous. Guns without shells are symbols rather than weapons. Artillery units rationed fire, holding back even when targets presented themselves. Infantry conserved rounds, altering tactics to avoid engagement rather than dominate it. Tank crews hesitated to engage because resupply could not be guaranteed. These decisions rarely appear in dramatic accounts, yet they shaped the flow of battles just as surely as enemy action. A well-supplied force could dictate tempo. A short-supplied one had to endure it. What made shortages so powerful was their cascading effect. A lack of fuel slowed convoys, which delayed food and ammunition, which in turn reduced combat power, which increased losses, which then required even more supplies to replace. The system fed on itself, for better or worse. When supplies flowed smoothly, momentum built almost automatically. When they faltered, the entire structure trembled. This fragility turned logistics into a form of warfare in its own right. Attacks on depots, transport routes, and fuel reserves were not secondary objectives. They were attempts to end battles before they began. The contrast between the warring sides grew starker as the campaign progressed. One side expanded its ability to deliver fuel, food, and ammunition even as distances increased, and infrastructure lay in ruins. The other watched its stocks shrink, its transport networks fracture, and its choices narrow. Courage and tactical skill could still produce local success, but these victories became isolated, unable to grow into something decisive. The real weapon was consistency, the ability to show up every day with full tanks, full magazines, and fed soldiers. From the moment it became clear that Allied armies were being sustained by something larger than battlefield success, German planners shifted their focus toward the lifeline itself. They understood a hard truth. Destroying divisions was difficult, but starving them was possible. If the flow of fuel, ammunition, and replacements could be broken, the Allied advance might slow, stall, or even collapse under its own weight. The result was a sustained effort to attack the war behind the war, an invisible campaign of airstrikes, sabotage, and intelligence operations aimed at severing the routes that kept Allied forces moving. Air power was the most direct tool available, and it was used relentlessly. Bombers and fighter bombers targeted rail junctions, marshalling yards, bridges, fuel depots, and ports with the clear intention of creating chaos, rather than immediate destruction. A single well-placed strike could back up traffic for days, forcing rerouting and overwhelming repair crews. Rail yards became graveyards of twisted steel, locomotives burned where they stood, and bridges collapsed into rivers that suddenly marked the end of movement. These attacks rarely made headlines, but their cumulative effect was meant to suffocate the advance by turning distance into delay. Sabotage added another layer of uncertainty. Small teams, often operating in civilian clothing, targeted tracks, switches, signal systems, and storage sites. The goal was not dramatic explosions, but subtle damage that would only reveal itself at the worst moment. A loosened rail, a delayed detonation, a contaminated fuel supply. Even the suspicion of sabotage slowed operations, forcing inspections and cautious movement. Rail crews and engineers worked knowing that the danger was not only overhead, but underfoot. Every mile repaired carried the risk that it would fail again without warning. Intelligence efforts sought to amplify these physical attacks. German analysts studied traffic patterns, identifying choke points where a single disruption could ripple outward. Reconnaissance flights tracked convoy movement and depot growth, while intercepted communications hinted at priorities and shortages. In theory, this information could guide precise strikes that achieved outsized results. In practice, it often arrived too late or was acted upon with resources that were already stretched thin. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and declining aircraft numbers limited how effectively intelligence could be converted into action. Despite moments of success, the campaign faced an unforgiving reality. Every attack had to overcome a system designed to absorb damage. When one rail line failed, another took its place. When a bridge fell, engineers rebuilt or bypassed it. When depots were hit, supplies were dispersed and moved. The Allies did not rely on a single route or facility. They relied on volume, redundancy, and speed of repair. German efforts inflicted pain, but rarely paralysis. Each disruption slowed the advance temporarily, but it did not stop it. As the war progressed, the balance tilted further. German air attacks grew rarer and less coordinated. Sabotage teams were captured or cut off, and intelligence became increasingly blind. Meanwhile, the Allied supply network expanded, thickened, and hardened against interference. The lifeline was no longer a fragile thread, but a braided rope, difficult to cut and quick to mend. Attempts to sever it continued, but they increasingly resembled gestures of resistance rather than viable strategy. There was a moment in the European campaign when victory seemed close enough to touch, yet fragile enough to slip away without a single major defeat. The front lines were moving fast, enemy resistance was breaking in places, and momentum appeared unstoppable. But beneath that sense of progress, the supply system was being stretched to a breaking point. It was a phase when success itself became dangerous, when distance expanded faster than capacity, and when the entire war effort balanced on the ability to keep material flowing through a system already operating beyond its intended limits. The warning signs appeared quietly. Fuel deliveries arrived late. Ammunition stocks dropped faster than planners expected. Repair units struggled to keep pace with vehicles worn down by continuous movement over shattered roads. Convoys grew longer, slower, and more vulnerable. Ports were congested, rail lines incomplete, and forward depots forced to operate on thin margins. None of these problems alone meant disaster. Together, they formed a pressure that built day after day, threatening to stall operations at the exact moment when speed mattered most. Distance was the silent enemy. As Allied forces surged forward, every kilometre gained multiplied logistical demand. Trucks burned fuel just to deliver fuel. Tyres disintegrated under loads they were never designed to carry. Engines failed from constant use, overwhelming maintenance units already short on spare parts. A system that worked well near the coast struggled when supply routes stretched hundreds of kilometers inland. Commanders faced a cruel paradox. Pushing harder increased the risk of collapse, but slowing down gave the enemy time to recover. At this critical phase, decisions that looked minor carried enormous weight. Choosing where to send fuel meant choosing which units would move and which would wait. Allocating rail capacity meant prioritizing one sector of the front over another. A single delay at a key junction could ripple outward, freezing entire formations in place. These were not dramatic moments of combat, but they were moments of consequence. Battles were postponed, opportunities missed, not because the enemy was strong, but because the system could not yet support further advance. The strain exposed how close the campaign came to stalling completely. There were periods when frontline units sat on the edge of breakthrough, unable to exploit it. Artillery rationed fire. Armoured units limited movement. Air support was constrained by fuel availability at forward airfields. From the outside, the advance still looked relentless. Inside the system, it felt precarious. Every delay increased the risk that momentum would evaporate, turning progress into stagnation. What prevented collapse was not a single solution, but a series of adaptations made under extreme pressure. Routes were reorganized. Traffic control tightened. Repair priorities shifted. Temporary fixes became standard practice. Planners accepted inefficiency in exchange for speed, pushing supplies forward even when it meant higher losses in vehicles and equipment. The system bent instead of breaking. It absorbed damage, fatigue, and mistakes, and continued to function just well enough to keep the front moving. In hindsight, this moment of near collapse is easy to overlook because it left no dramatic battlefield marker. There was no decisive defeat, no famous stand, no sudden reversal. Yet it was one of the most dangerous phases of the war. Had the supply system failed here, the advance could have slowed long enough for the enemy to stabilize the front, extending the conflict at enormous cost. That it did not fail speaks to the resilience built into the Allied logistics effort. The war was saved not by a single battle, but by a system that survived its own limits and emerged stronger for having been tested. When the supply system began to strain under the weight of success, Allied commanders faced a choice that would define the remainder of the campaign. They could cling to original plans, built for a slower and more predictable advance, or they could adapt in real time to conditions no staff exercise had fully anticipated. They chose adaptation. What followed was not a single breakthrough solution, but a cascade of innovations and improvised measures that transformed logistics from a vulnerable support function into a flexible instrument of war. This willingness to rework the system, even while it was already in motion, prevented disaster. One of the first shifts was conceptual. Commanders stopped thinking of logistics as something that followed the front and began treating it as something that shaped the front. Movement was no longer planned solely around enemy positions, but around what the supply system could sustain tomorrow, not just today. Advances were staggered, pauses synchronized with resupply, and objectives selected based on access to roads, rail lines, and terrain suitable for rapid repair. This mindset change allowed operations to continue without pushing the system past the point of failure. Innovation filled the gaps where existing structures could not keep up. Temporary solutions replaced permanent ones. Roads were reinforced with scavenged materials, steel mats, and rubble. Fuel was moved in flexible containers, rather than fixed depots. Forward supply dumps were created, dismantled, and relocated as the front shifted. Engineers learned to build bridges faster than the enemy could destroy them, often under fire and with minimal equipment. These were not elegant solutions, but they were fast, and speed was the currency that mattered most. Transportation methods were reworked to match reality. Rail lines, when available, carried bulk loads as far forward as possible, but trucks took over without pause where tracks ended. Convoy systems were reorganized to reduce congestion, with one-way routes, strict schedules, and centralized traffic control. Vehicles were pushed harder than peacetime standards would have allowed, accepting higher wear in exchange for immediate delivery. Maintenance became mobile, with repair teams moving closer to the front to reduce downtime. Every adjustment was designed to shave hours or days off delivery times. Commanders also embraced redundancy as a form of insurance. No single route was allowed to become indispensable. Supplies flowed along multiple paths, so that damage in one area did not paralyze the whole. Storage was dispersed to reduce vulnerability to attack. Communication between supply units and combat formations tightened, allowing priorities to shift quickly when shortages appeared. This flexibility meant that setbacks could be absorbed without triggering collapse, even when the system was under constant pressure. Perhaps the most important adaptation was cultural rather than technical. Initiative was encouraged at every level. Officers and non-commissioned leaders were given the authority to improvise, reroute, and repurpose resources without waiting for distant approval. If a solution worked, it was adopted. If it failed, it was replaced. This atmosphere of controlled improvisation turned logistics into a learning system, one that improved under stress instead of rigidly resisting it. By reworking logistics in this way, the Allies avoided the moment when success might have turned into defeat. The system did not become perfect, but it became resilient. It could stretch, recover, and adapt faster than the enemy could exploit its weaknesses. In the end, adaptation and innovation behind the lines mattered as much as any tactical brilliance at the front. They ensured that momentum survived uncertainty, and that the war effort continued to move forward when collapse was a very real possibility. The pace of a war is not set by ambition alone. It is set by what can be sustained. In Europe, the Allied supply line quietly became the mechanism that transformed isolated breakthroughs into continuous pressure, altering not just where the front moved, but how fast it moved and how long it could keep moving. Once this system reached maturity, it rewrote the tempo of the campaign. Offensives no longer surged and stalled in unpredictable cycles. They accelerated, paused briefly, and then resumed with growing confidence. This change in rhythm reshaped the entire push toward Germany. Before the supply network stabilized, major offensives were limited by uncertainty. Commanders could break through enemy positions, but exploiting those successes was risky. A rapid advance could outrun fuel and ammunition, leaving units exposed and immobile. As a result, operations were often cautious, with pauses built in to protect against logistical collapse. The battlefield reflected this hesitation. Gains were real, but fragile, and the enemy often survived long enough to reorganize behind the next natural barrier. Momentum existed, but it was delicate. Once the supply line could reliably feed large formations far from the coast, that fragility disappeared. Armoured units could push deeper without fear of sudden stoppage. Artillery could maintain sustained fire rather than ration shells. Air support became predictable, arriving not as a luxury, but as an expectation. Each offensive fed into the next. A breakthrough no longer ended with consolidation, it ended with pursuit. German forces found themselves pressured continuously, denied the time needed to rebuild defences or restore cohesion. This shift had immediate consequences for major operations. Advances that once would have paused for weeks compressed into days. Rivers were crossed, cities bypassed, and strong points isolated rather than reduced head-on. The supply system made this possible by ensuring that speed did not lead to vulnerability. Fuel followed tanks closely. Ammunition followed infantry. Repair units followed both. The front became elastic, able to stretch forward without snapping. In this environment, the enemy's traditional defensive advantages eroded rapidly. As Allied forces approached Germany itself, the impact on pace became even more pronounced. The enemy's infrastructure was collapsing, while the Allied system was reaching peak efficiency. German units retreated faster than they could resupply, while Allied units advanced faster than expected. The supply line did not just support movement, it created a sense of inevitability. Every day that passed increased Allied strength at the front, while diminishing the enemy's ability to respond. Time, once a neutral factor, now worked decisively in one direction. The psychological effect was profound. German commanders could no longer plan for pauses in Allied operations, because those pauses rarely came. Defensive lines were overtaken before they could be fully organised. Counterattacks lacked fuel and ammunition, making them brief and costly. The pace of the Allied advance forced constant retreat, draining morale and exhausting what remained of Germany's reserves. What might have been a prolonged struggle became a race against a system that could not be outrun. When wars are remembered, they are usually reduced to moments that fit neatly into memory. A decisive battle, a famous landing, a dramatic speech, a flag raised over ruins. These images feel like victory because they are visible, emotional, and easy to tell. What happens behind the front lines rarely fits this mould. Logistics has no single heroic moment, no clear climax, no instant where the outcome visibly turns. And yet, in Europe, one of the most decisive victories of the war was achieved far from the fighting, through a logistical success so complete that it quietly erased its own drama. That is why it is so often forgotten. The supply system did not win the war in a single stroke. It won it slowly, relentlessly, and without spectacle. There was no day when newspapers could announce that the logistical battle had been won. Instead, there were thousands of days when fuel arrived on time, ammunition did not run out, roads were repaired overnight, and damaged vehicles returned to service instead of being abandoned. Each of these moments was too small to stand alone, but together they formed an unbroken chain of success. Popular narratives struggle with this kind of story because it lacks a clear villain, a single turning point, or a dramatic reversal. It is a story about prevention rather than triumph. Another reason this victory is overlooked is that logistics works best when it is invisible. When the system functions properly, nothing appears to happen. Armies move as expected. Offensives continue. Commanders seem decisive. The absence of crisis creates the illusion that success was natural or inevitable. Only when logistics fails does it attract attention. And by then, the story usually becomes one of defeat, not of the system that normally prevented it. In Europe, the Allied supply network succeeded so thoroughly that it removed itself from the narrative, leaving the battlefield to take all the credit. There is also a cultural bias at work. War stories tend to celebrate individual courage, tactical brilliance, and dramatic risk. Logistics is collective, procedural, and repetitive. It depends on coordination rather than heroics. on discipline rather than daring. The people who built and maintained the supply line, engineers, drivers, dock workers, rail crews, planners, rarely fit the traditional image of the warrior. Their work was essential, but it did not align with the way wars are usually told. As a result, their contribution fades into the background, even though the front line could not have existed without it. The logistical victory also challenges comforting myths about how wars are won. It suggests that success was not just the result of better generals or braver soldiers, but of systems, planning, and industrial capacity. This is an uncomfortable idea because it reduces the role of individual genius and replaces it with organization and scale. In Europe, the outcome was shaped less by sudden inspiration than by the ability to deliver the same results day after day. That kind of victory feels less romantic, even if it is more decisive. Yet the consequences of this hidden success were enormous. Because the supply system worked, offensives did not stall. Because it adapted, breakthroughs were exploited instead of wasted. Because it endured damage and recovered quickly, the enemy could not regain the initiative. The battlefield victories people remember were made possible by a structure that ensured they could be repeated. Without that structure, even the most famous operations would have ended as temporary successes, rather than steps toward final victory. The forgotten victory behind the front lines deserves attention not because it was dramatic, but because it was transformative. It turned warfare into a problem of sustainment rather than survival. It ensured that time worked in favour of the Allies rather than against them. And it demonstrated that modern war is not decided only where bullets fly, but where supplies flow. The fact that this achievement rarely appears in popular narratives says more about how wars are remembered than about how they are actually won.